welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. If you're listening to the podcast today anywhere in the New England area, you're probably pretty much like me and you take these things for granted. That is, stone walls. I always thought there wasn't really much to know about stone walls, just rows of rocks that pass through the woods and made for a beautiful view. Well, it turns out how wrong was I. Our guest today is Professor Robert Thorson of the University of Connecticut's Earth Sciences Department in Storrs. Now, he is New England's foremost expert on stone walls. And just wait until you hear what he has to say. In fact, you're going to find out all you did not know about stone walls in just a moment when Thor, as he prefers to be called, joins us. This week's trivia question: it was made in 9 parts and was supposedly designed to hold everyone going to heaven. What was it? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Back in 1962, environmentalist Rachel Carson wrote a seminal book, Silent Spring. He recounted how a chemical substance found in birds' eggs had rendered them infertile. She argued that if we didn't tackle this problem, our springs would be silent with no bird noises. Well, it's widely credited with spawning the environmental movement in subsequent years and decades. Also back a long time ago, 1914, poet Robert Frost wrote one of his more famous poems, Mending Wall. It's about a stone wall behind his house and the fact that it created a fence between him and his neighbor. Well, that poem sparked a debate about walls and fences and their relative value. Were fences good things between people or even countries? Well, fast forward to today, and Professor Robert Thorson, who incidentally prefers to go by the nickname Thor, is pushing an effort to try and characterize stone walls. He wants to make sure that they're treated the same as any other surface feature when we make decisions about land management. Now, he's written several books and a whole ton of articles on the topic. His book, Stone by Stone, The Magnificent History in New England's Stone Walls, is absolutely fascinating. He and his students at the University of Connecticut's Earth Sciences Department work with this fantastic new mapping technology called LIDAR, and it actually allows the mapping of stone walls like they'd never could be seen before. In fact, for today's interview, Thor walked outside of his home to the back of his house where the woods are so he could better focus on the topic at hand. He was looking at several stone walls that make up the estimated, are you ready for this, 240,000 miles of stone walls throughout New England. Thor, it's a pleasure chatting with you today, and I must say that when I first set out to do a podcast episode on stone walls, I was a little bit panicking because I thought, what if I run out of questions? And then I started reading some of your information on stone walls and some of your research, and I said, I'm not going to have enough time. It's a fascinating topic, and I guess where I want to start off is, I often ask guests, how'd you get involved with this or that or whatever. How did you get involved with wanting to study stone walls?
That is a good question. So basically what happened is I moved from Alaska to Connecticut to be the landscape geologist. This was in 1884. And I said, well, I better go look at the landscape, because I'd never really been in New England. And so I went out to the local state forest, the Natchog State Forest, and I just started walking a traverse. And I couldn't believe the stone walls that I'm climbing over and walking around. They're just everywhere in the woods where they haven't been removed. I mean, I'm standing in the woods right now looking at one. In fact, there's 2 of them within my eyesight. So they're just everywhere. So I said, what is that thing? Now, if you grow up in a place with trees, when you're a grown up, go up to a tree and say, "What is that thing?" You know what it is. It's a tree. But if you've never seen one and you go up and see a stone wall, you say, "What is that thing?" And the what is was coming from a person who was a professionally trained glacial geologist, archaeological geologist, and so forth.
What people tend to do, and I'm guilty of this as well, is you get so used to your surroundings, you don't even realize what you're looking at. And you just said the magic words. You came from Alaska where they don't have stone walls. How unique are stone walls to New England?
They are unique as a regional signature landform. That is, nowhere else that you go in this country will you see them so pervasively at the scale of tens of thousands of square miles. You can go elsewhere and find a stone wall in California or in Arizona. The difference is that in New England, you have to explain why they're not around, and everywhere else you say, why are they around? In New England, it's people just dealing with the farms that they're creating in stony country. They are the ecological result, and I'm talking human ecology.
So explain human ecology. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that if you act like us, we get in our garage, we get in our car, we drive somewhere on pavement, we walk on a sidewalk, we go into an office building, and we do stuff, and we're not really that surrounded by nature, or it's not in our face. If you're out living in the world, with rocks and trees and fields and farm animals, and you don't have a car, and you don't even have a tractor, okay? You're dealing with the earth all of the time. So the choices you make are constrained by what nature offers or doesn't offer you. And here, nature constrains your behavior by giving you fertile agricultural soils with the downside that they've got stones in them. And so what are you going to do? That's where you're going to put your best fields. That's where you're going to keep your sugar bush. That's your woodlot. That's your barnyard. Basically, the landscape will have a strong determinant on what you do with your life. So human ecology is just thinking ecology. So just think forest ecology, with squirrels and chipmunks and wild turkeys and coyotes and whatever you want to put in there. There's your ecology and you're in it and you're doing it. But human beings are treated just like any other organism in that ecology. And of course, we have great power and we do great things, but it doesn't remove us from the ecosystem. It becomes an agro-ecosystem in New England sense.
The issue for Connecticut residents, usually, as we call it, Connecticut's most abundant natural resource, rocks, and you're always finding them in your yard, in your garden, and they're kind of viewed as an annoyance. And I think if I've got your research correct, essentially our ancestors, who were the farmers here back in the 1600s, found them to be an annoyance too, and that's why they piled them into stone walls. Is that oversimplifying it?
Stone walls serve many functions. They obviously will support a house if they're in the form of a cellar home. They're going to pen in some animals in the case of a town pound. They're going to define the edge of a property and define your neighbor. And they're also an architectural beauty. Sometimes people do interesting things with their walls to make them look really nice. But the fundamental purpose, just like a watch is to tell time, the fundamental purpose of a stone wall is to hold stone. And if you start there, then you can move on to all the higher orders or stylistic or architectural or societal or historical interpretations of stone walls. And so basically what happened is that if you were to take the original forests and the landscapes that were here when the first European settlers arrived, and if you were to just chop down all the trees, and if you were to start farming that with pasture or cultivation or with animals trampling all over the ground or no matter what you're doing with it, you have changed the physics. You have changed the microclimates. You've changed all of the geological processes operating in and near the surface. And the net effect of most of those is to make the surface stonier. And so what happens is, just like you talked about a stone coming up in your garden, what you're going to do is, there's a stone. You pick it up and you pitch it, right? And if you're in a garden, it's not too far. But if it's in a large area or field, you're going to scuttle that stone out of the way. And the initial process was often just to build piles here and there, just like when you rake leaves in the fall. You take the fringe, they're like the 20 feet out from the edge of your lot, and you rake those into the woods, don't you? And then what do you do with the stuff in the middle? You basically rake it into piles, put it on tarps, and then haul it into the woods. But the end result is you're always hauling the leaves out to the perimeter. And the same sort of thing happens with the stone. They show up in the field, they get pitched to the fence lines that are already there. And if you keep doing that, you get more and more and more stones around the edge of your field. And you also have a place now to put the piles of stone that come from the middle of the field, somewhere else. And you can begin to space those out. And the next thing you know, you got a stone wall around this piece of land.
Now, two statistics that I want to hear you talk about and give your opinion about. Number one is the one about 240,000 miles of stones being more than Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, and Pyramids of Giza. A second one is that in one article I read of yours, you talk about the earliest stone wall going back to 1607, very specifically that year. So I want to sort of get an answer for this. How did you figure that out?
Well, lucky me, the first thing that I got that statistic, 240,000 miles, came out of an earlier book that was ahead of mine. It was Susan Alport's Sermons in Stone. But in her book was a citation for a census of fences. In 1870, they inaugurated a national census of fences. And most of it was about, fencing the West and all of that. But New England said, well, we got to have our census too, So they got one. And there were all these agricultural commissioners that reported to a statistician in Washington, D.C., in the Department of Agriculture or whatever it was. They could count the length of fencing by county throughout New England. And Susan Alport got this from, this is really going to sound crazy, she got it from a guy named Oliver Bowles, who was the mining commissioner for the United States. And he looked at the stone walls along the roads in New England and everywhere, and he said, oh, what a great opportunity. These are quarries. We can take all of those stones and crush them into road beds so we can have decent roads instead of terrible roads. And, that makes perfect sense. We use it in all of our concrete aggregate, and we put it under our road beds, and it's great stuff. And so I think we lost a lot of the stone walls because of that. So what I'm saying is he did an inventory using that old census of fences, and he came up with that original number. But my best guess is that we probably lost about half of them because the stone was being used for other purposes. But once we get to the 60s and 70s, the so-called environment movement and the historic conservation movement, we began to see stone walls somewhat differently. They're part of historic preservation. And I really think that the stone walls are defining human ecological signature landform, and they should, to the extent be possible, leave them in place or, dress them up, so that we can connect better to our heritage. So 240,000 miles is a long way. That'll go around the Earth 10 times. That'll go to the moon.
And how did you get back to 1607?
There's a book by Howard Russell called The Long Deep Furrow, 400 Centuries of Farming in New England. And I was reading the whole thing, and I found either a footnote or a line in there about a letter that was written from somebody who visited the Popham colony in Maine. Somebody went there and found some old stone walls and wrote to somebody else about them. So Russell referenced that letter. And the Popham colony was the other Virginia settlement, in 1607. One went down to Jamestown, Virginia, and barely survived. Another one went to the coast of Maine and didn't survive. And they obviously built a stone wall, or somebody wouldn't visit the site a few years later and write about it. I think it's cool to think that New England's oldest stone wall, actually dates to the same age, 1607, as the first permanent English settlement in the United States. You get to places near the coast along the original colonial settlements where they were sort of bottled up along the coast for the first century. You have walls that date from the original founding. But most of the hinterland of New England, most walls are simple agricultural things done in the century between 1750 and 1850. And they're built by people who lived on those farms and worked on those farms. And so the walls are just part of the farming effort. Now, this is very different from Gilded Age walls, where they'll come out with a team of people and some rich person with money that comes from somewhere else. Perhaps it's oil, or perhaps it's copper or mining. The money comes from somewhere else, and they use that money to hire a crew to build a wall around an estate. That's a very different thing from the more elemental and, as far as I'm concerned, more archetypical New England wall. To me, they're even more evocative because they're parts of human ecology. You can see the farmer just living his life and coping with it. In Stone by Stone, my book there's a paragraph that I tend to go back to. The farmer is not caring as much about the walls as we do. He's caring about the arable field between the waste stone that he's used and stacked it up to get it out of the way.
One of the things that I would love to talk to you about now is your emphasis on the science of stone walls and your desire to create a brand new taxonomy on this. Could you explain what would be involved with creating this?
Well, first of all, I think everybody knows what a classification is. We have a world that is a continuum of people and a continuum of places and a continuum of things, but part of us really needs to break that down into categories, like months of the year, right? Or El Nino or not El Nino. We need to take the continuum and break it down. And we certainly did it with biology, deciding this is a vertebrate, that's an invertebrate, this is a mammal, that's a reptile, da-da-da-da-da. And there's really two kinds of classifications. One is sort of the bin sorting activity called a genre. What kinds of old rifles are there? Or what kinds of music are there? Or what kinds of restaurants are there? So what we do is we just kind of bin sort. We throw them into different bins, and that's fine, but we don't really have rigid rules for doing it. We just say it looks like a Mexican restaurant. It is a Mexican restaurant. We don't worry about that. But if you were to define a Mexican restaurant, then you'd have a lot more trouble because some might or might not make your definition. So the alternative to a typology is a taxonomy. And a taxonomy is a rule-driven classification that anyone with the right ingredients can reach the same conclusion. In other words, you remove the subjectivity by forcing a decision tree of questions. Is it made of stone? Is it continuous? Is it high enough? You ask these questions, and as long as you have criteria to separate the questions, you can do a scientific classification of stone walls. And of course, it's very complicated because it's trial and error, and you have to decide what are you going to classify it on. Are you going to classify stone walls based on the type of stone they contain? Or are you going to do it by their structure or by the degree of order? This is well built, not well built, terribly built. In other words, there's any way that you could go into the problem and begin a classification. Let me just say, when I got into this business, there were classifications, but the words were used interchangeably, like, oh, that's a pasture wall. Somebody else would call it a farmer's wall. Somebody else would call it a single wall. Somebody else would call it a stacked wall. Somebody else would call it a tossed wall. In other words, the same thing has about 9 different names. The taxonomy that I knew of, or the classification system that made sense to me, was a single wall versus a double wall. Now, this is not something that I invented. I'm trying to, incorporate that into a taxonomy. So the idea is, at the top of the wall, is it built with just one stone along the top, or is it built with stones built against each other from opposite sides? And if the answer is one, there's only one stone, then it becomes a single wall. If it's 2, then it becomes a double wall, and you and I would not make the mistake. We would be able to have that. And then you can decide, is it capped or not? Is there a capstone on it or not? Then you have to define a capstone, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And so what I did was I was going to publish a taxonomy, and I did in a 2005 book, a trade book, now out of print. It's not exactly the one that I finally published in a peer-reviewed historical archaeology, which is actually peer-reviewed and published. So there is a taxonomy out there if you want to use it, and some people are. The reason that I think we need to manage them is obvious when you think about wetlands. To me, the stone walls are the dryland habitats. They're a counterpart to the wetlands. But think about wetlands, even in the late 80s, people were just filling them and dredging them. But we began to realize in the 80s, there's a lot of hidden values in wetlands that we weren't paying attention to before. So we were just destroying them and doing this and that. Once those values got recognized, we began to classify wetlands carefully and legally. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. What is a water of the United States? Simultaneously, I think we've ignored the drylands because we've thought of them as quaint historical things. But no, to me, they're the signature landform of New England. They come from the human ecology of agriculture on top of glaciated hard rock soils. And so what I want to do is use the classification as a first step towards the understanding and management in a scientific way. And I'm sad to say that it takes 5 criteria in order to do it to the precision that a lawyer would need or a scientist working with a taxonomy. And so now when 2 lawyers come up to one and they say, oh, this is just a pile of stone, and therefore we can do whatever we want with it, the other lawyer says, no, this is a stone wall because it meets these criteria. The one who has the criteria is going to win the argument.
Now, I want to wrap this up by taking you back. I'm not exactly sure when you did this, but I'm aware you did this. You went to Derry, New Hampshire. And to set this up properly, right, this is where Robert Frost lived, and out back of the house that he lived in was a stone wall, and he wrote a poem called Mending Wall, which in 1914 kind of raised the whole category of stone walls to a different level, and people were saying, good fences make good neighbors and whatnot. So when you went there, considering your background in stone walls, this is maybe the most famous stone wall in the world. And how did you feel when you saw that?
Well, first of all, I was elated to be at the place where that poem was written. I mean, at the time I first read that poem, I was just a grade school kid in Illinois. I'd never seen a stone wall, but here I am reading about them. But I felt wonderful to be at that authentic place where I could look at the walls. And then I was, in the next instance, disappointed. And I was disappointed because based on my eagle eye for stone walls, I realized that his wonderful poem was a conflation of 2 walls on opposite sides of his pasture. So there is no mending wall. There is one, but it's only half of what he's talking about. It's not the good fences make good neighbors part. The mending wall that he's writing about is the one that is nearly falling apart all the time, because it's made of loaves and balls and cobbles. You have to cast a spell to make them balance. Okay, the other wall is the territorial wall, the one with his old stone savage of a neighbor, and he has to walk the line to make sure the wall stays kept. That wall is actually a fairly well-built wall of slabs, not rounded cobbles, and so it stays that way no matter what. And so here's this most famous poem about a wall actually being a conflation of 2 walls. And so then my disappointment got to excitement because now I have something to share, a closer look at stone walls because people love that poem. I think what Frost did was sort of underestimated. What he did was he took the stone walls and he made them more valuable as symbols and as tokens. He made them more valuable than they ever were as fences. Okay. I just think that's really ironic and really fascinating because we love our stone walls. We're now starting to protect them and getting more serious about it every day. And that traces back to that moment when Frost wrote that poem. John F. Kennedy, president, he sent Robert Frost to Russia to talk about mending fences. I think that's just spectacular.
That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. With the help of Thor's work, there's even now a state law in Rhode Island which defines what a stone wall is. He's also pushing to have every state park in Connecticut inventoried for stone walls and categorized. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Professor Robert Thorson of UConn's Earth Sciences Department in Storrs. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it was made in 9 parts and was supposedly designed to hold everyone going to heaven. What was it? The answer is the New Haven Green. Yes, that core part that serves as the center of New Haven and has been at the center of the city's culture for more than 400 years. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to have a look at the green from the perspective of it being the oldest such green in the country, as well as answer some of the mysterious questions behind it, such as why it's often referred to as the most haunted place in New Haven. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.